An absolute titan of the music industry, Chuck Berry's contribution to contemporary sound is indisputable. With a road to stardom equally decorated by success and controversy, the father of rock forces each of us to ask ourselves whether we can separate the art from the artist. Chuck Berry was always getting up to no good, but things took a truly twisted turn in 1990. That was the year that officers raided Berry's home, hoping to find evidence for a possession charge. Instead, they stumbled upon heinous proof of the rock star's sinister side. But more on that later. Chuck Berry was born on October 18, 1926, to an unassuming middle-class family. Being the fourth of 6 children, Berry was no stranger to a sense of community. Their neighborhood in St. Louis, Missouri, however, was quite segregated in certain respects, specifically from a racial standpoint. Berry lived in such a segregated neighborhood that it took a fire for him to first see a white person. Being only 3 years old, Berry recalled thinking that the firefighters' faces were simply chalk white with fear at having to deal with such a roaring blaze, but his father explained things to him properly. Despite his somewhat isolated youth, Berry found a sense of true belonging in one specific place. From the very beginning, music was present in Berry's life. Berry's father was a local church deacon. The church choir familiarized him with music from an extremely young age, and he had joined the choir by the time he was 6 years old. One day, Chuck Berry and some of his friends went on a joyride in a stolen vehicle before sticking up several local businesses. Despite being a minor, he ended up scoring a 10-year sentence. He would spend the next portion of his life at the Intermediate Reformatory for Young Men. In spite of his rather bleak situation, Berry still managed to make the most of things behind bars. Musically speaking, Berry didn't skip a beat. In fact, he took it upon himself to form a musical quartet with some other convicts to sing for the reformatory's church services. Their musical ensemble impressed everyone so much that they played at a handful of venues outside the confines of the prison. After serving only 3 years of his sentence, they released Berry early on good behavior. It wasn't long after tasting freedom that he started to turn his life around. After his release from the reformatory, Berry quickly established a new life for himself. In 1948, he married Themeta Toddy Suggs. They would be together for the rest of his life. Soon after their marriage, they had their first child together. All of a sudden, Berry had a family of his own. But there was one problem plaguing his happiness. Stardom was still relatively far off for this working family man. Berry took on all kinds of jobs just to pay the bills. He labored as a factory worker, janitor, and beautician. After some hard work, Berry and his family were financially stable enough to purchase a lovely house, settling into their new home in 1950. After a small hiatus from music, Chuck Berry got back into the local gig scene in St. Louis. A show here and a gig there served as a source of reliable side income, but nothing more. Eventually, ambition kindled in the soon-to-be star's heart, and he went in search of a record deal. His destination? Chicago, the Windy City. It was a recommendation from a friend that transformed Berry's life forever. Muddy Waters advised Berry to contact Leonard Chess, the co-founder of Chess Records in Chicago. Berry did just that, and soon secured a deal with the label. Within the same month, Berry recorded his breakout track, Maybelline. People went nuts for Maybelline. Believed by many music scholars to be the first rock and roll song, Maybelline was the catalyst that spurred decades of success for Berry. Listeners were eager for more, and Berry was more than happy to oblige. The creative floodgates had opened, and it would be a while before they dried up. To call Berry prolific would be a gross understatement. A slew of more singles were released in the wake of Maybelline, many of which were finding their way onto the charts. Hits included Rock and Roll Music, Johnny Be Good, and Sweet Little 16. With a cavalcade of instant classics, it came as no surprise that everybody wanted their piece of the money pie. Soon after the release of Maybelline, Barry found himself back in the court of law, only this time he was the prosecutor. Much to his annoyance, Barry had noticed a couple of names claiming writing credit for his music, which of course guaranteed them a certain amount of royalties. Royalties that Barry was unwilling to part with. He took them to court and was able to reclaim full writing credit for Maybelline and all the respective royalties. If music groups as popular as the Beatles are huge fans of your work, you know you're doing something right. The late John Lennon once said, "If you tried to give rock and roll another name, you might call it Chuck Berry." Barry's role as a muse for bands like the Beatles made for some great musical hits, but there was a time when they took a little too much inspiration from his music. Barry's publisher at the time, Big 7 Music, sued John Lennon over similarities between Barry's song, "You Can't Catch Me," and the Beatles' recently released song, "Come Together." They were finally able to come to a resolution when Lennon agreed to record some music for Big 7. By the late 50s, the rising star seemed unstoppable. He had attended and played at countless clubs and eventually decided to open one of his very own, naming the flashy new venue Barry's Club Bandstand. As a testament to his mass appeal, Barry opened the club in a predominantly white district. The venue was indicative of his incredible success, but it also acted as the catalyst for one of the most disturbing points in Barry's life. Barry found himself in a world of trouble after hiring a new waitress for his club. As it happens, he'd made the mistake of mixing business with pleasure, and the young woman turned out to be a young girl who was only 14 years old. Barry's poor decisions ushered in a second sentence. 5 years behind bars. He ended up appealing the court's decision and received a lower sentence of only 3 years. In the end, however, the star would only end up serving a measly 1.5 years for his actions. Despite this apparent good fortune, he would never be quite the same. After serving his second prison sentence, close friends and co-workers noticed a dramatic shift in Chuck Berry's temperament. Carl Perkins described the new Barry as distant and bitter. But while the star wouldn't quite reach the same heights of popularity as before, he was the furthest thing from unsuccessful. Despite his many personal low points, Barry's career was far from flatlining. In fact, in many ways, he reached new heights. By 1972, his music had reached the top of the charts, with his live rendition of My Ding-a-Ling being the song to finally do the trick. The artist hadn't lost his touch, musically or otherwise. The 70s also marked a shift in focus for Barry. By the 70s, Barry was no stranger to touring, but this would be the decade that he would hit it hard. Trading time in the studio for more opportunities on stage, the mobile rock and roller had no trouble filling venues. With nothing but well-earned confidence and his Gibson guitar, Barry attracted audiences to his shows not just for his music, but for the wild energy he displayed on stage. Chuck Berry's live performances weren't just about the music. He famously delivered incredibly entertaining shows due in large part to his stage presence. His explosive energy, paired with a respectable repertoire of signature dance moves like the duck walk, ensured that audiences were rapt. During his heavy touring years of the 70s, Barry made a strange request to any venues that would have him. He demanded that they pay him in cash for his gigs, and you can bet he was making more than just spare change. Now, if they paid him in cash, then he wouldn't necessarily have to report that income to the government. It was only, well, tax evasion. This resulted in him having large amounts of cash on hand. But it didn't end well. In the case of prospective prison time, the third time really isn't the charm. Barry's many cash-only dealings with music venues finally caught up to him in the form of one of the world's scariest entities, the IRS. This resulted in his shortest prison sentence, 4 months and 1,000 hours of community service. If you were to hire Chuck Berry for live performances during the 70s, You only got him and his guitar. The venue would have to supply the backing band and instruments themselves. In 1972, the Rolling Stones' legendary guitarist Keith Richards was part of the backing band for one of Barry's gigs. Things seemed to be going well for this collected supergroup, until, that is, Barry shouted into the mic during the show that the keyboardist and guitarist, Keith Richards, should get off the stage. To make matters worse, Barry soon admitted that he didn't even recognize Richards, one of the most famous guitarists in the world. There's a rock star lifestyle, and then there's Chuck Berry's lifestyle. This was no doubt an equally hilarious and soul-crushing moment for the Rolling Stones guitarist. But this wasn't the only eventful encounter between the two stars, as Barry would end up bruising more than Keith Richards' ego. In one famous encounter, Richards got a little too comfortable backstage at one of Barry's show, and earned himself a punch in the face for his transgressions. While Barry performed at many venues in the 70s, there was one that was without a doubt the most exclusive. Whether or not Barry, or anyone for that matter, agreed with then-President Jimmy Carter's political ideologies, the big man nonetheless invited Barry to perform at the White House. Just as he was one of the first rock stars, Barry was also the first to receive an honor of a certain accolade related to the genre. It seems like a given that Chuck Berry would be the first inductee of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He helped invent the genre, after all. But can you guess who swore him in? None other than one of his biggest fans and fellow rock stars, Keith Richards. It seemed that no matter what he did, Keith Richards would continue to idolize Chuck Berry. Richards even went as far as to organize a celebratory birthday concert for his idol's 60th birthday. The event managed to convey just how cherished Berry was, as it included legendary musicians such as Eric Clapton. As yet another sign of Berry's level of superstardom, his 60th birthday party concert was also made into a documentary film, Hail, Hail, Rock and Roll. It worked out to be a celebration of the rock star and all of his contributions to the world of music. It seems that the most unsettling events surrounding Berry's life happened in the establishments that he owned. In 1990, several women sued Berry for installing a camera in the bathroom of his restaurant. While the accusations didn't result in any convictions, Berry ended up paying over $1 million in legal fees. That same year, authorities raided Berry's house. They found evidence of some of Berry's darker actions, including scathing proof of child abuse. Berry's wrongdoings remained serious, but he seemed to get better and better at escaping any real repercussions. The star managed to dodge the most serious charges that came out of the raid, and consequently only received 2 years of unsupervised probation for possession of illicit substances. After a 38-year hiatus from recording studio albums, Berry figured he still had one left in him. The 90-year-old rock and roll legend graced audiences with a new one titled Chuck. Berry dedicated the album to his wife Toddy, but it would be the last one he'd ever release. Berry's impressive discography, paired with the amount of time since his last release, could leave some to assume that his last record would be disappointing. Those people would be wrong. Yes, Berry still had it. Chuck received overall positive reviews from music critics, many of which praised the album for recapturing the iconic artist's style, while still remaining unique from previous releases. Unfortunately, Berry wouldn't be around to receive his due praise. The much-anticipated Chuck was released in June 2017 to the joy of many listeners, but unfortunately, its creator wasn't around to see its reception. On March 18, 2017, emergency services arrived at Berry's home after the star suffered a heart attack. The rock legend passed away at the age of 90. Whether you boycott an artist for their personal actions or not, we feel it's important to know somebody in their entirety. Publications today still discuss the acclaimed artist Chuck Berry. Both sides of him. His music and his controversies will endure alongside each other, and we think that's a good thing. The one thing we know for sure is that the world won't forget about Chuck Berry anytime soon. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, we'd really appreciate it. We also invite you to check out the companion article in the description below. If you want to see even more videos on historical figures, please subscribe to the channel.